name is Nathan Brewer. I'm a vice president with Sapient Government Services. Sapient's a global business and technology consulting firm and the 14th largest advertising company in the world. The challenge for all conference planners is really 3 sessions of any conference. It's the pre-lunch session, the post-lunch session, and the pre-happy hour session. And they've done you right today in terms of lining up this wonderful panel for you, of experts really to talk about the enabling power of technology. As all of you, I'm sure, are aware of, as people who shop, you've seen the power that technology has exerted on consumer markets over the past decade, and the government has not been immune to that. Particularly if you look at the reality of the government operating in a world where it can issue a press release and then line up a few key journalist interviews and then call it a day is long gone. It's a 24/7 conversation with citizens now, and it's requiring government to change in a whole new way. One of the great examples of this is the TSA blog. TSA is constantly looking for ways to interact in new and creative ways with the public. If you think about that blog, it was launched on January 30th, 2008. So 4 years ago, they began that conversation. And at the time, there were a lot of naysayers, and in retrospect, it's been a phenomenal success in doing a lot of things that our previous panelists had talked about in building community and transparency through government with that. Today's moderator is a distinguished journalist, Joe Marks. He is a staff correspondent for Nextgov. He also writes an emerging tech blog, and he covers government technology issues, social media, Gov 2.0, and global internet freedom for Nextgov. Previously, he reported on federal litigation and legal policy for Law 360, and prior to that, covered local and state and regional issues for 2 Midwestern newspapers. So with that, Joe, the panel is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I am very excited to be here today with this panel because to talk about collaborative technologies, social, mobile, cloud, and the way that they're changing government. And this is about the best panel we can imagine for that. As you guys know, this is really a watershed time in changing the way that government gets work done and the way that collaborative technologies work into that. It can be from the email system you use, to the way that people share documents now, to the way they communicate with the office through a mobile app when they're away from it, to the amount of work you can actually get done when you're away from the office, and then also, very importantly, the way that government is communicating with citizens and the way they're being more transparent. So we're lucky, especially to have Vivek Kundra here, who came up with all of this for 2.5 years as the first federal CIO. He really reshaped the way that the government looks at technology, and especially the way that the government looks at social and mobile technologies. The new digital strategy is coming out in a couple of months, and I wouldn't be surprised if his fingerprints aren't very much on there. The way that the government looks at collaborative technology, I think, is being done much more at an agency level and much more at a government-wide level than previously, and he's responsible for a lot of that. He left government in August and to take a fellowship at Harvard University, and he is now the Executive Vice President for Emerging Markets at Salesforce.com. We also have Nolan Jones, who is the Director of eGovernment Innovation at NIC. And if you don't know NIC, they are by far the largest organization working on e-government kinds of issues at a state level, especially doing a lot of things with fantastic both inward-facing government mobile apps at the state level and outward public-facing mobile apps, which he's going to talk with you about. We also have Jeff Rogers, who is Director of Public Sector Industry Solutions at IBM. And as most of you know, IBM has also done a lot of work with leveraging data, mobile, social, to help city and state governments, county. I think you said you do pretty much every level of government that you possibly can. So I'm going to turn it over to them soon. I want you guys to know I'm going to try to make this as much your questions as I can and as little my questions as I can. So very quickly, I'm going to open it up. So start thinking of questions quickly. Feel free to tweet, #EIGCon, and I'll turn it over to these guys with a first question. They can tell you a little bit more about what they do, but my first question is going to be, give me a couple examples of real concrete, real-world new technologies that you've seen in the last 12 months that are changing the way that government operates. Vivek?
Sure. Well, I think, when you step back and look at what's happening around the world, for that matter, and you look at the social networks that are out there, there's been a lot of hype in terms of people's expectations, but I think what's happening now, today, is that's being turned into reality. When you look at a platform like Facebook with over 900 million people on it, you look at Twitter with over 200 million people actively using those networks, and it goes on with LinkedIn and YouTube and so forth. When it comes to public services, you look at New York City, for example. The mayor there has basically said that he's going to make business formation a central part of his administration. And he's actually using a lot of these social technologies to streamline and eliminate the bureaucratic maze of how businesses are created across the city. When you look at how people are actually interacting as far as customer service is concerned, I'll give you an example also on the consumer side with Comcast, for example. If you go online and you use Twitter, Comcast is actually using that for customer service now. So that if somebody complains on Twitter and says, I've been waiting for my cable person to show up and it's been 2 hours, they actually will turn that into a ticket and dispatch someone and actually follow up with you when it comes to customer service. When we look at what's happening at the government level in the state of Texas, for example, they've created social apps where they're collaborating and cutting down costs. So they've built 22 applications that agencies are sharing amongst themselves, but they're also leveraging it to actually provide better service to their customers. I think that this notion of customer service in the 21st century is going to be extremely different than what we've seen to this point. It used to be that you would send an email, you would actually hold on the phone. Now what you're seeing is people actually expect their government also to respond to these new social channels. No longer does it have to be on a central government website, but actually using the very networks that people are using every day, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn.
Nolan?
We produce over 7,000 different types of applications, everything that you can think of, from renewing your driver's license to registering sheep in Montana. There's a growing expectation among citizens and the government itself that mobile be a key component of what they do. And one of the things I find most interesting is states like Utah, where they've taken a mobile-first approach now, that they're designing everything for mobile from the get-go, and then building on the web standard PC type interface after that. It forces a discipline of thinking about what information is most important to the citizen or the other government agency, depending on what they're doing, and how that information is going to come back and forth. By focusing in on mobile, they can also leverage all the different technologies there right from the get-go instead of trying to bolt it on after it's been developed. So a state like Utah has over 1,000 applications now, services that they provide that are mobile enabled. And we're seeing that more and more across the United States, where they're taking that information, what they're doing, new services, and thinking about it from mobile right from the beginning, and then expanding it out there for other platforms as well.
Jeff?
Thank you. Yes, so I'm with IBM, and public sector really refers to government and healthcare, and I have responsibility globally. And I guess I'd share a couple of best practices, if you will. And one is not only how we as people interact with systems through our handheld devices, but IBM's Smarter Planet messaging, our Smarter Government messaging, is really not only how we incorporate that type of information, but how we incorporate a number of different sensor devices that are out there. So it could be sensors in bridges, it could be monitoring patients, et cetera, and really trying to aggregate all of that information and make better use of it. So a couple of best practices that I would share is, one is sort of a crowd sensing model that we've been able to use, including with the United Nations and others, where we pick a certain topic, like security or green government, and we have what we call a jam. And we will invite in hundreds of thousands of participants and feed in domain experts and have different forums that people can collaborate, share experiences, and then try to filter out of that what are best practices where we might want to go and invest. So that jam technology has been very helpful for sort of aggregating demand. Secondly, we're very interested in taking that other information and pushing it out to people in mobile devices so it helps them improve their productivity in the workplace. And we have many examples of that in the public safety environment. New York City, which you mentioned, has our crime center, and they actually can have people on the street, police at a scene of a crime, use their handheld to request information from their repository of data information, get a response back. We're incorporating biometrics so I can take your picture and compare it against a bunch of known faces that might be of interest out there, and trying to provide that type of real-time information to government employees on the street as we go forward. The final areas of best practice I'll mention is we're sharing a lot of experience about what IBM has done in our terms of our transformation. We have a highly mobile workforce. I just went to a meeting in New York last week, and I've dealt with this person for 2 years, and it was the first time I'd met them face-to-face, because we're leveraging all of our collaboration tools of chat and messaging and not online video conferencing as much as web conferencing. But those are the experiences that we're really trying to share and leverage with the governments around the world.
So Jeff, you already talked about this a little bit, and Nolan, you talked a lot about having a mobile-first solution so that everything you're doing online you can also do on a mobile-enabled website. Limited resources being limited, how do you figure out when to build a native app for government? What do you look at and what goes into it? How do you decide that it's the sheep counting or the sheep registering that matters?
Well, that's a huge debate even within our company about when native versus web-based, and it's evolving pretty rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I think there's two driving factors when we consider whether it's native or mobile web. First is PR. A native app it gets you a lot more PR. It's easier for the press to report about it. It's easier for people to find it. It's got some panache to it. Second is, are they attempting to leverage specific functionality on the device that may not be lend itself as well to the mobile web? So if they're trying to do some more advanced features, leverage the camera, those sorts of things, it may make more sense for a native app. The third it's a lesser approach because they both have pros and cons to it, is how often are we expecting that citizen to go back to that app? Is it a one-time event? Most people now are not going to download an app just to do one thing. It better have some multiple purposes if they're going to download it. If it's something that's a one-off event, then a mobile web app makes much more sense for that type of service. If it is, however, something, downloading the lottery numbers for the week or something where they're going to be regularly going to that service, then a native app may make much more sense.
I'd just add, we're seeing a number of examples where we used to write for the web interface and then transcode it to a handheld device. We're actually seeing requirements come out where the primary is build the application for the mobile device and then create a version for the web. And so when you think about really trying to attract tourism, making things easier to navigate for some of our disadvantaged, disabled population, those are some very powerful things that we're seeing out there.
Can you tell us about a tourism app that you've worked on?
Yes, so we did something in New York City where they were interested in really trying to help people navigate their way through the complex New York City travel system, buses, subways, walking, to some of the key tourist locations. And so out of our Paris, France location, we have our Human Computing Solutions Lab. And they did that application for the New York City to really boost tourism and make it much more friendlier experience for people to be able to use their handheld app. You've got the GPS location capability. You can actually make references or recommendations as to what's close in, which we can maybe get to before it closes, et cetera. So it's really a very powerful tourism aspect there.
And Vivek, you spent a career in government, a long career in government, working with social and mobile, and now you're at Salesforce. What have you learned in, 6 months now in the private sector that you wish you'd known in government? What's been the biggest lesson of that transition?
Well, I think the biggest lessons as I'm traveling the world, I've had the opportunity to spend time in Europe, in Australia, and in Japan. And I appreciate even more the scale at which government has to deal with these challenges that most organizations don't deal with, right? So if you look at even the private sector, a lot of these agencies within the public sector end up being the entire size of some of these multinational companies. So that's sort of lesson one in terms of the complexity at which government operates. I don't think a lot of people appreciate. Second, I think is something that I had talked about when I was also in government, is the technology gap that exists between consumer technology and public sector technology, and how you essentially have an ecosystem of vendors and an ecosystem as far as the procurement system is concerned that doesn't really allow the most innovative solutions, the lowest cost, the fastest to deploy to enter, right? And that's pretty consistent as I've looked at what's happening around the world. And third, I would say, is that I've noticed that the conversation that we're even having around whether you build a native app or a web experience, is that there's a lack of an obsession around the user experience, right? I think that should be sort of the first principle, which is what is the user experience and how are we architecting all these solutions? I think part of it is that historically the public sector has focused very much on infrastructure, and now there are a set of technologies that enable it to abstract away from purely infrastructure spending to actually thinking about, from a very anthropological perspective, what is that experience of a single mother in Ohio when she's accessing unemployment insurance? What is the experience of a 16-year-old who's getting ready to apply for college in terms of the FAFSA form, right? And I feel like that's where there needs to be a greater obsession when it comes to the public sector itself.
And that's sort of what's behind the businessusa.gov site, isn't it? I mean, that's a first real take on making a user interface for citizens that is much simpler regardless of what is actually happening inside the government.
Exactly.
So Vivek, what are you seeing? Can you give us some examples of, you said you've been traveling a lot in Australia and India and elsewhere in the world. Can you give us some examples of new technologies, new apps, new social software that you're seeing in those travels that's happening in other countries?
Well, at a national scale, what you're seeing, interestingly enough, is some really, really early set of investments around core infrastructure. So for example, in India, there's a focus on building a unique ID system. So 1.1 billion Indians can actually be part of the digital world. And what's happening there literally is a unique digital ID is being created for everybody who's in India. And they've set up a separate agency that will authenticate. And so banking will run on top of that in terms of online commerce. You'll see how subsidies are distributed to welfare checks, all on top of this platform that's being built. In Australia, what you're seeing, interestingly enough, is a huge focus on infrastructure deployment. So getting literally fiber to every citizen's home. And that's doable in Australia because there are about 20 million people in terms of the population. So they're literally running fiber to every household. So they could actually re-engineer the very notion of government. So how do you run hospitals and telemedicine with that infrastructure? How do you think of a digital post office with that infrastructure being built on top of that? In Japan, what we're seeing is some really interesting stuff with Japan Post, for example, the entire postal service moving to the cloud, and on top of that, actually providing services online from banking, sort of entering new channels that they may historically not have been in. But I think all these countries also are looking at this new world. How do they transform themselves for the social era? How do they think of services in the 21st century? And what got them to where they are today is not what's going to get them to where they need to be. So a lot of the leaders, what I was really, really impressed by, are actually beginning now to think about technology and delivery of services with a beginner's mind. So how do you think about architecting solutions with what's happening in the ecosystem of technology that's available today? And what I mean by that is that if every single IT project in every government around the planet came in on budget and came in on schedule, everybody would still be unhappy with the results. They would still be unhappy, and the reason is because that is not how citizens are using technology. And that is what I mean when I talk about transforming government for the social era, that the social era is very, very different. It's a bigger transformation than anything we've seen throughout history where you're seeing governments being toppled as a result of people organizing and collaborating online with a single employee named Will Gonem from Google, who was basically tweeting and asking Egyptians from around the world to come in and help rebuild their nation, to a 19-year-old nanny based out here in Washington who tweeted, "I will not pay these fees." She took on Bank of America, and a multi-billion-dollar multinational company had to change its policy to look at what happens to Netflix and its stock when its customers didn't listen. It tanked.
All right, I want to open it up. Lisa is here with a microphone. Anyone who has a question, raise your hand. Try to keep them short in questions. I think we have one there.
It's been a very interesting discussion so far on services that the government provides to citizens and that interaction. Can you also address some of the developments that have to do with interactions within the government with regards to problem solving, please?
I can give a good example of mobile reimagining how people actually do their job and problem solving. In the state of Indiana, they obviously inspect school buses, just like every state does. And there's 17 full-time state officers that all they do is go and inspect these school buses. Every year, thousands of them. And historically, it's been a paper-driven process, and they move on to the laptop, a little bit of their... When they decided they wanted to do this mobile, instead of just taking what they'd done on a laptop and saying, okay, now you get a smaller device to go do the same amount of work, what they did was they re-examined the entire process of doing that inspection. What were the challenges? What were the what was working right? What was working wrong? And re-engineered the entire process to take advantage of a tablet device. So historically, a inspector takes years to develop all the codes, know which needs to be inspected, go through the whole process. There's well over 100 items on that bus that would need to be inspected. What they did was go through it and make it searchable. Now when you go through it, it'll walk you through the engine, walk you through the cab, walk you through the tail, go through the lights, all the rest of it in a sequential order, as well as allowing those more experienced, seasoned individuals to just start entering codes and going through it. But they also then started thinking about, okay, what can we do with the technology that we're not doing? Capturing pictures. If we see a defect, now we're going to take a picture of that information so that there's a historical record. They're using 2D barcode. Instead of entering in information about that bus to go pull up the information, they just snap a thing, pulls up the information about that specific bus, saves a lot of data entry. If they don't have cell phone communication, that's fine. It all runs there natively until they hit cell phone reception, gets loaded in there. So all those processes, that whole re-engineering of it, really changed the way that they approach their job, speeded up training, saved money, hopefully will gather additional information to make the buses safer. If they see a consistent problem with a right tail light on a Bluebird bus, now they've got that information to go grab that, identify if they've got a larger problem, and go solve that.
Does someone have a... Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think in terms of internal productivity, some of the most effective things we are seeing really are the more mundane areas. So chat service capability. I mean, the idea that if you've got a directory where you can search for expertise and reach out to another department across the country, to somebody you might not even know, and ping them and have a trusted sense of identification and connection there and get an answer or get information about your problem is really, really very, very powerful. We've got whiteboarding capabilities, but the other thing that we have is sort of we call it connections. But again, how do you aggregate certain chat rooms or certain bulletin boards where information of relevance is sort of aggregated and refined over time so that when you want to do research, you go to that section. So, it's not quite as sexy as having my iPad, although I could use my iPad to access the information. But some of those things have really been fundamental to improving productivity within an organization.
If I can add to that, I think one of the biggest gaps in technology that I see between the public sector and the consumer web is actually the very notion of a social network, right? So how many of you are on Facebook or Twitter? So
how many of you have private and public?
Right. Why is it that you don't have an employee social network, right? To address some of the same issues here, which is why is it that I know more about my friends and I know more about what people who basically just friended me about their life than I do about the work that I engage in every single day. And I think this notion of creating a employee social network is so important. And the idea of kind of getting government to collaborate in problem solving, to share knowledge, to basically create communities of interest, that just isn't happening. We're not really seeing that, and I think that's an amazing opportunity, not only to lower the cost of government operations by cutting down on travel and other expenses, but it's also an amazing opportunity to actually tap into the ingenuity of employees that you may have never even heard of. Right? In my time in government, I used to have to work really, really hard to actually find the smartest people in the front lines, because I knew that's where the real work was happening, on the front lines and not in the layers of management that were built up over the years.
Now, you talked about cutting down travel time and about the way that employee social networks and mobile devices can make people more productive wherever they are. You know, because we're at a conference now, the thought of a certain other conference always comes to mind. And you know, the government already, even before the GSA scandal, was looking for ways to save money. But post-GSA, conferences are getting a lot of heat. Is there a way that these mobile and social technologies can fill in those gaps so you're still getting that kind of knowledge share without spending the money on even the good conferences?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, look, web conferencing is standard fare, you know, whether you want to have a conference call number and just present charts, or whether you want to have the interactive web environment. And so I think that's very, very germane. And then the podcast. I mean, you know, Mr. Wintergren referred to it. If we're going to attract the future generation of employees, they work differently. My nephew goes into work at 11 and leaves at sometime between 9 and 11 at night. So you have to make information available to them when they're ready for it, just like we talk about our citizenry, but the employees of tomorrow are going to be quite different. So I think the podcast format can be very, very powerful.
Well, I think it's also, you know, I would argue that it's better than a point-in-time conference to invest and build out these employee social networks, because they persist across time. And what I mean by that is, how many of you have gone to a conference and then you walk away and you have no idea what really, you know, was the substance and the notes and the people and how do you connect? But the ability to actually build out this employee social network, but also invite your customers, invite your partners, and tap into that knowledge and persist around problem sets that you could solve across time. It's not only going to drive up productivity and improve knowledge sharing, but it's also going to destroy this notion of distance, right? If you think of the US government, there really isn't a single agency that's not international, right? USDA is present around the world. So how do you get, or the State Department, right? How do you get, you know, the most innovative person who may be working in a country, in a bureau, to be able to contribute to a conversation that's happening in Washington?
Now, I wanted to jump back to Nolan's story about Indiana school buses. Do any of you have a story like that at the federal level of the way that an internal mobile app has changed the way people are doing their work?
Well, in the national intelligence community, we're doing a lot of work around a concept called GeoCop, Geo Information Common Operational Picture. And it really is leveraging a lot of that back end, what we call the big data, all the information sources, and presenting it in a temporal, time-based standpoint and a geospatial standpoint to help them have really strong analysis information on the field. And, you know, to your comment, we are in tough financial times. You know, we've done a project with Gatorade where they're tracking public sentiment. And we'd certainly like to track sentiment, how do people feel about the EPA or the TSA. And yet, the funding mechanism is very difficult. And where we've really been able to free up the most money is in those sort of public safety, national intelligence areas to date. But I think they are setting a good course for us that are practices that we will be able to leverage into other parts of government around the world.
Questions? One down here.
Do you have any success stories of using mass collaboration within the federal government with social media, where they built some kind of social media environment and they they actually used the mass collaboration to do something positive other than bringing down the Egyptian government.
Sure.
Well,
So
go ahead.
So I think there are a whole host of amazing stories, right? So if you look at some of the more innovative work that's happening even within the White House, with whitehouse.gov, the petitions that were created where people were collaborating and actually influencing policies. If you look at the SOPA debate, it actually ended up changing a position as a result of communities coming together, self-organizing, the White House looking at that petition and actually making a policy decision based on that. That's pretty significant because it impacts the broader economy.
And this is the We the People site, if any of you haven't looked at it, which draws in citizen petitions, and if they cross a certain threshold, you'll get a White House response or a response from somewhere within the federal government.
I was just the jam technology that I referenced earlier, but it's not really a sustained environment. You try to pick like a 3 or 4 day period and really get concentrated focus and participation in the discussion forums, and then people do the back-end analysis. But it's that example is a fairly short window that we've done that type of engagement.
One thing I've noticed, and this is on a sort of micro level, and I think this started under your watch, was the number of idea scale surveys that are coming out of the CIO's office for pretty much every major project they do. There is a probably month-long idea scale survey where you get input, people rate the input up or down, and you'll often see the way that works into the final policy. Other questions?
Hi, Amy Tyrone. I'm from Homeland Security and actually specifically TSA. You kind of touched on this guy on the end. I guess it's Jeff.
Jeff, thank you.
So we talk a lot about open government, transparency, and using tools to enable the public to use services, and very open kind of systems, and using social networks and mobile apps to do that. What kind of trends or challenges have you all seen or come across with using those tools specifically to relay highly sensitive data, or protected data, for example, for security or intelligence, those kind of purposes, and moving towards these kinds of social networks / mobile apps?
So it's a very good question, and we've done a number of projects with defense organizations, both in Europe, Australia, and NATO, where we're trying to push actual battlefield information out to what they call the tip of the spear, to the soldier in the field. Security is absolutely essential. And you deal with little bandwidths, and you deal with, again, how do you aggregate information and determine what information, because you can't overload those people with information. And they've got a very small form factor that they can deal with. So the security is there. There's all type of SSL sockets that people will talk about what we use to try and make sure that nobody else can co-opt that information. And same thing for information coming back. So I think the one example, during one of the airstrikes, people were under attack, and they sort of radioed their GPS coordinates, and then we were able to send in air cover to help, fend off the attacking forces. So both ways in terms of that exchange of sensitive information, if that helps address the question. I'm sorry? Absolutely. It's a critical requirement. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask, when we talk about a social network between government and citizens, and the way you interact with citizens on mobile devices, and part of this is a security question, part of it is just sort of an ideology question. There's Americans especially, you talked about India, everyone having a unique identifier, and that's something that's controversial in this country. And there's this sort of natural American concern about your government following you, whether it's on Twitter or not. How do you deal with that kind of anxiety that you see in the public, and how do you address that, and at the same time still try to do really good customer service?
I'll give an example of that. In the state of Kentucky, they released an app called Eyes and Ears on Kentucky. It allowed people to report suspicious activity, primarily focused in on terrorism. The state, not sure how much is going on in Kentucky. That would be that nervous, but it's a strong step, and a number of other states have adopted that platform as well. The big concern coming out of the gate with that is this is a big brother, because people can report through the app anonymously. They can provide geolocation, they can provide pictures, they can provide all kinds of information. well, what do you have going on with your neighbor? Is there that? Are they going to get overwhelmed with false complaints? Are we going to create this atmosphere of distrust?
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. And what we found is that once people really started understanding that you can already call 911, you can already submit things anonymously through a variety of things, you can write a letter. This was just providing a platform that people have become much more used to using, to report, to discuss things with, through a mobile platform, that the resistance that maybe we were expecting with that type of platform never really occurred. And now we're seeing more states adopting those platforms to report all kinds of information. Obviously, the more basic stuff, potholes, all the way up to, why is that gas truck parked over here for that long? I don't know what's going on. I'll let somebody else know. So I think it's the evolving perception of what people are expected to do and what they can do with those types of technologies that are eliminating or at least reducing some of those concerns.
Vivek, what did you see when you were in the White House? Was there the same amount of anxiety in the public you might have expected, less, more? How has the world become social in that way yet?
Well, I think it's definitely evolving, right? So with every technology, I remember in the public sector itself, when you go back to the mid-90s, there was this whole debate around should we use email or not? Then the big debate was websites. Should we or should we not launch websites? What if we put out all this information? Are we making the government less secure? And you kind of trace it to the evolution of technology itself, whether it was client-server in the 80s, or you go back to the 60s and 70s, and you look at mainframe/mini computer to mobile, right, in 2000, and now you're looking at the social revolution. The challenges around privacy obviously are real, right? And government entities are making sure, as far as their privacy policies are concerned, that they're addressing those up front. I think it's a bigger policy question than it is a security question. And I think from a citizen's perspective, what's happening, which I found fascinating now, being on the other side, is the citizens actually expect a level of interaction because they're commenting on these public networks. So Twitter, by its very definition, is a public platform, right? It's not a one-to-one sort of messaging platform itself. And I think more and more people are becoming comfortable in terms of engaging, not just in terms of service with their government, but also, commerce. So they're being pitched, whether it's particular deals or customer service, like the Comcast example that I mentioned, or problem solving in these public social networks.
Other questions? One thing that we've talked about a little bit around the edges, but haven't addressed directly, is the question of how mobile technologies can contribute to transparency. Do you guys want to address that? And what kind of transparency? Because there's been some debate about open data versus sort of traditional accountability kind of open government. And it seems as if social technologies and mobile technologies can kind of do both in a way.
I can give a good example of a mobile app. State of Arkansas, they were getting in all the federal ARRIS funding, all this money that they had to do. Big concern about how that money was going to be spent. They created a mobile app and as well as a web presence to show individuals based on their geolocation what was being spent with those funds right in their very area. Updated, we're up at 50% spend. Here's what we're doing on this bridge, this road, all the rest of it. By using that geolocation data, it made it much more relevant to an individual than maybe a larger, we've spent $12 million in the state so far, or we've spent it on this bridge, but not really relevant to that individual. By giving them that information, making it much more transparent regarding how their money is being spent, I think it eliminated a lot of concerns about how the state was handling their funds, to what they were getting for it, and three, the status of it. Where were things going? Was it delayed? What questions needed to be asked? Those sorts of things.
I'd say two things. One is, I think it's incumbent on us as technology providers and you all as the end users to look at ways that we make technology more valuable to our constituents. And the more that we're pushing out information to mobile devices of information that's relevant to people, I think the more they will see that they're getting the value for their tax dollars that they're investing. So an example of this, I'd say, is a project that we're doing out in Los Angeles. And we're actually tracking GPS transponders in cars and cell phones to monitor the traffic on the freeways, to try and predict when bottlenecks are to occur, and to alert people that you don't want to leave the office now because there's going to be a big backup on the 405. And I think we've got a ways to go, but I think as we really start focusing on what's of value to our constituent base and how we push out relevant information to them, that's really where the transparency will come in, because they'll see they're getting the level of service that they're expecting and maybe that we've committed to up front from our agencies.
Questions? One over there.
I apologize if you may have covered this, but I haven't heard it. I came in a little bit late. I would like to know what kind of aggregate or analytical type information you're using to draw from these transactional kinds of things, because these are individual transactions that are likely repetitive. Where's the business analysis that's behind it that can make that information aggregate and available?
Jeff, that seems sort of like a question for you about the data sources you were talking about before.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, it runs the gamut. I mean, when you go and buy something, there's a point of sale transaction that occurs that can be analyzed. So we've got pilot projects where we're looking at economic development to be able to track down to the street level of where economic activity is occurring based on those types of swipes. So we're looking at all sorts of information, and information that maybe you wouldn't even necessarily on the surface connect together to try and provide insights to go forward. We've just launched our Smarter Analytics, I'll call it an advertising campaign, but it's certainly supported by a number of financial investments in terms of acquisitions, our research department. If you look at the IBM Watson technology that we launched for the Jeopardy show, I mean, it was two things there. One, it ingested just a world of information, so that's one accomplishment. But the real accomplishment of Watson was it interpreted human language to some degree, because you can use words in very different contexts as a person, and giving the machine the intelligence to be able to interpret that and come back with, here's 3 responses with our level of confidence on each of those. Now you decide as the person, as the expert in your field, which of the 3 you want to go with. But we've provided you as much information we can, and that's connecting all kinds of different information that may or may not even seem linked. So I'm happy to discuss that in a little bit more detail afterwards, but that's about all I'd say now.
You know, big data is, people have been calling it the new cloud. It's the new buzzword of this year at least. And there was, if anyone missed it, there was a really great session right before this about the way that data was used by HUD and VA to reduce veteran homelessness. And one of the big things they talked about a lot was, well, we've figured out that we have all this data around us all the time, but we're still not quite there on figuring out which data is the good data, which data is the important data, which questions we should be asking. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it relates to government services?
Well, sure. We sort of put this under the umbrella term called sense making. And it really is, you know, how do you look at the data sources that are available to you, both the physical data storage that you have in your, but all of those sensor devices that are out there in the world that are increasing today. And then really look at, as I mentioned earlier, the algorithms. So we've got, you know, our litany of scientists and research that we marry up with experts from a given agency to try and say, what are the patterns? What are the algorithms? What are the dots that you might connect? And then, based on what you learn, perhaps create a rule that you put in the front end of your application that may prevent a certain activity from not happening again. So a lot of the threat and fraud area. So when we find what we feel is a behavior pattern that's potentially of concern, we will try to write some rules that will diagnose that on the front end before we pay dollars out that we have to try and recoup from somebody that may have moved or closed their business, and try and prevent the funds from going out in the beginning. So this is really a very, very interesting area going forward, and I'd invite any of you up to our Hawthorne Research Lab where I can have the real experts talk to you in your department.
Nolan and Vivek, do you have some thoughts on that, about the ways that you can gather data to figure out what's working and what's not in your social and mobile outward-facing technologies? I know one thing, if you guys go to federal websites as often as I do, you know, about every 5th, 6th time you've got the ACSI survey popping up. I know that's one data point, but what else do you guys look at?
Well, I think from my perspective, I would say, you know, when we talk about sensors, we traditionally think of sensors as in intelligent transportation systems, and actually letting you know patterns around traffic congestion or patterns around sort of roadways where construction should happen. Or you look at sensors around the healthcare system, where we're seeing now the very nature of the internet itself is changing to where you can put on a Nike Fuel Band and it will transmit your blood rate, your heart rate, and blood pressure and heart rate, and improve sort of healthcare outcomes. But what we haven't really talked a lot about is when we think about people and their everyday lives and how they're instrumenting the entire planet. So there are about 7 billion people, but there are about 5 billion mobile devices. And across the world, people are, whether they're taking pictures or they're tweeting about the weather or they're talking about what's happening, they're generating terabytes and terabytes of that data. And the problem that you articulated in terms of how do you slice and dice and cube all that data to separate noise from signal is critical. But it's not just a notion of, well, how do I store all this data, whether it's structured or unstructured, and then get some type of business intelligence or analytics on top of it. The real question is, well, how do you do it real time, right? Because events are happening on a real time basis. So how do you take all these transactions that are happening around the planet and get insight in milliseconds rather than days, months, or weeks? I think there's some amazing, amazing stuff happening on that front. And I think on the other front, in terms of the enterprises themselves, as far as you think about whether it's agencies like you mentioned, HUD, in terms of programs that they're managing, or Department of Homeland Security like TSA, you're getting a lot of really interesting data that's sort of crowdsourced, right? So you get data on wait times within TSA, and you could actually just get it through some of these networks, these social networks. But when it comes to the performance of government, there's a lot of investment happening right now around big data, but unfortunately those investments are around upgrades rather than saying, look, we already have these data sets. Why don't we move towards an open API policy framework where every single system, you start creating open APIs, and then on top of that, you could start building really, really interesting analytics. So this notion of democratizing data, creating open APIs, and getting third parties to help you innovate on top of that.
I think that's an excellent point. I would just add that, because I think you touched on it, the requirement is there to be able to analyze information on the fly without ever storing it. I mean, certain of our agencies, the volume of satellite traffic, the volume of voice traffic that they're monitoring, and they're looking to find, the 50 bytes of relevance in a multi-gigabyte stream that they can pass to an analyst and collect one of those dots from a sense-making standpoint. And that's a real key, I think, to addressing the big data challenge.
I think one of the areas where we really focus in on a subset of that data is keeping people out of offices. What we try to identify is why they're going into government offices for something that could be done online or some other mechanism, because that's wasted resources that could be focused in on more advanced things if there's no reason for that individual to be in an office. So we look at why they're going in there, we look at the kind of questions they are, and then a lot of times that's breaking down barriers about, they didn't know they didn't have to go in, or they could turn in data once and submit it to multiple agencies at one time. A lot of that is our focus on gathering all that information together and then making those kind of decisions, because individuals really don't care what agency they're dealing with. They just want to get to the resolution of the problem. So a lot of times we're just collecting that information to find out what their challenges are and getting that information to the agencies and trying to break down those barriers.
Well, we're closing up now. I'm just going to do one last quick question, 30 seconds each, which is, what do you see happening next? What's the next thing that's going to happen in government? And Vivek and Nolan, you can give your own answers, but Jeff, is it going to be Watson?
Watson will be a piece of it. It's an analytics world. The speaker earlier this morning said, how do we take and provide better insight to the people that are interfacing with the citizens going forward?
I think it's going to be government employees using mobile devices, tablets, iPhones, iPads, Android devices to change the way they're doing their job. It won't be everybody, but it'll be a large number of individuals really re-examining how they do their job and the way they do it.
I think the biggest opportunity for the government is to transform for the social era.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Joe.
I hope you